Hello everyone, welcome to the Story Tales, your place for the best horror stories. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I've been listening to horror stories for years, and now I'm here to share the most amazing ones with you. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It all started with a letter that changed my life. My name is Alex, and until that moment, I had lived a pretty ordinary life. I spent my days working and my evenings with books or movies, nothing too exciting. But one rainy afternoon, as I sat near the window with a cup of tea, something slid under my door. It was strange because I lived on the second floor of a quiet apartment building, and I hadn't heard anyone outside. I stood up and walked to the door, half expecting it to be a mistake or a delivery from my neighbor. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. All that was there was an envelope lying on the floor, old and slightly yellowed. My name was written across the front in a neat, careful script that I didn't recognize. I stared at it for a moment, feeling a twinge of unease. Back inside, I tore it open. The paper inside felt heavy, like it carried the weight of time. The message was short, but clear. I had inherited a cabin deep in the woods, left to me by a distant relative whose name I couldn't even recall. The details were vague, but it included an address, a map, and a small rusted key tied to the letter with twine. I frowned, trying to piece together how I could have inherited anything. My family wasn't particularly large or wealthy, and the few relatives I knew lived far away. My parents never mentioned a cabin or this mysterious person who had left it to me. The whole thing felt off, but my curiosity got the better of me. A cabin in the woods sounded intriguing, and I figured it could be worth something. The next morning, I packed a bag and set out. The drive was long, winding through narrow roads and dense forest that seemed to stretch endlessly. As the sun dipped lower, the trees cast long, jagged shadows over the road, making it feel like I was heading into another world. By the time I arrived, the daylight was almost gone. The cabin stood at the end of a narrow dirt path, surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to press in from all sides. It was old, the wood weathered and gray, with a sagging roof and broken shutters that clung to the windows. The small porch creaked as I stepped onto it, the boards groaning under my weight. I hesitated for a moment, the key cold and heavy in my hand. Something about the place felt wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the silence. The forest around me was utterly still. No rustling leaves, no chirping birds, not even the faint hum of insects. It was as if the cabin had swallowed all sound. Taking a deep breath, I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant click, and I pushed the door open. It resisted, scraping against the floor like it hadn't been used in years. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of damp wood, and something else I couldn't identify. The first thing I noticed was the darkness. The cabin had windows, but the thick layer of grime on the glass let in only a weak, murky light. I fumbled for a light switch and found one near the door. A single bulb flickered on, casting a dim glow over the room. The living room was simple, a fireplace made of rough stone, a sagging couch, and a few mismatched chairs. Bookshelves lined one wall, their contents hidden under layers of dust. I walked further in, my footsteps leaving clear prints in the dirt and grime on the floor. That's when I noticed something that made me stop. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were faint but unmistakable, leading from the door to the fireplace. My stomach tightened. The letter had said the cabin was mine, abandoned for years, but these footprints told a different story. I followed them cautiously, my heart thudding in my chest. They stopped in front of the fireplace, the toes pointing toward the hearth. I crouched down to get a closer look. The dust in that spot had been disturbed, almost as if someone had stood there recently. I glanced around the room, my nerves on edge. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and out of place. No answer. Shaking off the unease, I set my bag down on the couch and decided to explore the rest of the cabin. The kitchen was next, and it was just as worn as the living room. Old appliances sat silently, their surfaces covered in grime. The cabinets were filled with dishes and cans of food, all untouched for what seemed like decades. A single chair sat pulled out from the dining table, as though someone had been sitting there not long ago. I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had shifted it, or maybe it was already like that when I arrived. By the time I finished exploring, night had fallen completely. The darkness outside was absolute, and the cabin felt even more isolated. I found a bedroom upstairs that seemed the least dusty and decided to sleep there. The bed was covered in an old sheet, which I shook out before collapsing onto it. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Who had left those footprints? Had someone been staying here before me? My thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a tap, 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 coming from somewhere downstairs. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped, and the silence pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. Probably just the house settling, I muttered, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to me. As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was alive, watching and waiting. Something about this place wasn't right, and deep down, I knew I was only beginning to uncover its secrets. Sleep came reluctantly, creeping in like an unwelcome guest. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to rest. The tapping sound from earlier echoed in my thoughts, an unanswered question that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Even with the door to the bedroom closed, the unease seeped in, coiling around me like a cold mist. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke with a start to the sound of a door creaking open. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment I lay frozen, unsure if I was dreaming. The noise came again, this time followed by the faintest shuffle of footsteps. I sat up, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The room was pitch black, the faint outline of the window barely visible against the inky darkness. The sound wasn't coming from upstairs. It was downstairs. I reached for my phone, but the screen remained dark when I pressed the button. Dead. Of course. I cursed under my breath and slid out of bed as quietly as I could. The wooden floor groaned beneath my weight, and I winced, pausing to see if the sound below would stop. It didn't. In the hallway, the darkness was thicker, almost tangible. The air felt heavier, colder. I gripped the banister as I descended the creaking staircase, each step echoing in the stillness. My hands were clammy, and my breath came shallow. The living room was bathed in a faint silvery glow from the moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. Shadows stretched and shifted across the room, playing tricks on my eyes. I scanned the space, searching for the source of the noise. Everything seemed untouched, just as I had left it. And then I saw it. The footprints. They were clearer now, outlined starkly in the dust, leading from the fireplace toward the front door. But there was something else. New ones, smaller, overlapping the original set. My stomach churned as I realized they were heading in the opposite direction, back toward the fireplace. I stepped closer, drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity. The hearth looked as it had earlier, a simple stone structure, blackened with soot and age. But now something glinted faintly in the firebox. I crouched down, hesitant, and reached for the object. It was a small metal locket, tarnished and cold to the touch. The chain was broken, and the clasp on the locket wouldn't budge. My fingers trembled as I turned it over, noticing an engraving on the back. LB, 1923. LB, I whispered, the initials foreign to me. The tapping sound returned, louder this time, and unmistakably close. My head snapped up, and my eyes darted around the room. It was coming from behind the fireplace, where the stone met the wall. I stepped back, my grip tightening on the locket. The sound grew more insistent, like knuckles rapping against a door. I wanted to leave, to run out of the cabin and never look back, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, a whisper. "Help me." The words were barely audible, carried on a breath of air so faint I thought I might have imagined it. But the plea was there, desperate and haunting. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Was someone trapped? Was this some cruel joke? I forced myself to move, grabbing a flashlight from my bag on the couch. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the fireplace and the surrounding area. I searched for any sign of a hidden door or panel, something that might explain the noise. The stones of the fireplace seemed solid, but when I pressed on one near the base, it shifted slightly. My heart leapt as I pushed harder, and the stone gave way, revealing a small, dark cavity behind it. Inside was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. I pulled it out carefully, brushing off the dust. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwriting that was neat but hurried, as though the writer had been in a rush to record their thoughts. I flipped to the first page, my hands shaking. The date at the top read April 12, 1923. Beneath it was a single sentence. "I should have never come here." The words sent a chill down my spine. I turned the page, my eyes scanning the entries. The journal belonged to someone named Lila Bellamy, L.B. The name was unfamiliar, but her story unfolded in vivid detail. Lila had inherited the cabin much like I had, though her connection to the previous owner seemed clearer. She described arriving at the cabin with a sense of excitement, eager to escape the city and find solace in the woods. But her entries quickly grew darker. She wrote about strange noises in the night, whispers that seemed to come from the walls. She mentioned the tapping, always at the same time, always near the fireplace. And then, the dreams began. "They come to me in my sleep," one entry read. "Faces I don't recognize, calling my name. They tell me to leave, but I can't. Something won't let me." I flipped through the pages, my pulse quickening. Lila's writing became more frantic, her words harder to decipher. She wrote about seeing figures in the woods, shadows that moved when there was no wind. She mentioned the locket, calling it the key to everything. The final entry was dated June 3, 1923. "I can't take it anymore. The whispers won't stop. They want me to stay, but I won't. Tonight, I'm leaving. If anyone finds this journal, know that the locket must stay hidden. It's the only way to keep them at bay." The entry ended abruptly, the pen trailing off the page as though she had been interrupted. I stared at the journal, my mind reeling. What had happened to Lila? Had she escaped, or had she become another part of the cabin's dark history? The tapping started again, louder and more insistent. I turned toward the fireplace, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The whispers returned, overlapping and indistinct, like a chorus of voices just out of reach. "Leave," they said, the word clear and urgent. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed the journal and my bag, heading for the door. But as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't turn. It was as though the door had locked itself. Panic surged through me as I yanked at the door, my breath coming in short gasps. The whispers grew louder, filling the room like a rising tide. The locket in my pocket felt impossibly heavy, as though it were anchoring me to the spot. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The cabin fell silent, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made you acutely aware of your own heartbeat. I turned slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, as though they were closing in. In the corner of the room, near the fireplace, something moved. It was subtle, a shift in the darkness, a shape that hadn't been there before. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. No response. I backed away, my heart hammering. Whatever was in this cabin, it wasn't going to let me leave without a fight, and I wasn't sure I could win. I stood frozen, the beam of my flashlight trembling as it illuminated the spot where the shadow had moved. The air in the cabin was thick and heavy, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic, echoing in my ears. The shape by the fireplace shifted again. It wasn't my imagination. Something, or someone, was there. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. No response came, only the oppressive silence of the cabin. The shadow stretched and grew, resolving into a figure, a faint, translucent form. A woman. Her outline flickered like a candle flame, barely tethered to the world around her. Her face was indistinct, but her posture was unmistakably one of desperation. Her arm raised, trembling, as she pointed at the fireplace. "Lila?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond, but her gesture became more insistent. The journal in my hand felt hot, as if it were burning, and the locket in my pocket felt heavier than ever. I stumbled forward, drawn by something beyond my control. "Is this what you want?" I asked, pulling the locket from my pocket and holding it up. The figure stilled, her entire being seeming to focus on the small, tarnished object. Her form grew brighter for a moment, more defined, and her lips moved. "Burn it." The words were faint but clear, carried on an unnatural breeze that stirred the air around me. I hesitated, staring at the locket in my hand. Burn it? That was the key? The one thing she had called the key to everything? "What happens if I don't?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The figure's face twisted, her features contorting in a mix of fear and anger. Her voice rose, echoing through the cabin like a scream. "They will take you. Burn it before it's too late." I stumbled back, the locket slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The moment it hit the ground, the cabin seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the whispers returned, louder, more frantic. I dropped to my knees, fumbling for the locket as the room spun around me. The air was electric, charged with a malevolent energy that made every hair on my body stand on end. The whispers grew into a cacophony, overlapping voices that seemed to claw at my mind. "Stay with us. You can't leave. Give it to us." I grabbed the locket and staggered to my feet, my vision swimming. The fireplace was the only thing that felt solid, an anchor in the chaos around me. I stumbled toward it, clutching the locket like a lifeline. The firebox was empty, but the ashes inside were still faintly warm. I didn't have time to question why. I tossed the locket into the hearth and grabbed the poker, using it to stir the ashes into a faint glow. The whispers screamed in protest, the voices blending into an inhuman wail that made my knees buckle. I gritted my teeth and struck the locket with the poker, sparks flying as the tarnished metal began to glow. The figure of the woman grew brighter, her form almost solid now. Her expression shifted, relief mingling with urgency as she raised her hands. "Hurry!" The locket began to twist and warp, the heat distorting its shape. The cabin shook violently, the walls cracking and the floor buckling beneath my feet. I could barely keep my balance as I struck the locket one final time. The metal shattered, exploding into a burst of light that blinded me. I threw my arms up, shielding my face, as the room was filled with a deafening roar. And then, silence. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the sudden stillness. The cabin was intact, the cracks in the walls gone, the air clear and calm. The oppressive weight that had hung over the place was gone, replaced by an almost peaceful stillness. The woman was gone. Her presence dissipated like smoke. All that remained was the faint scent of burning metal and the warm glow of the ashes in the hearth. I sank to the floor, my body trembling. It was over. Whatever had haunted this place, whatever had trapped Lila and the others, was gone. I picked up the journal, now cool to the touch, and flipped through the pages. The frantic, desperate entries had changed. The words were still there, but they seemed to radiate a sense of closure, as if Lila's story had finally reached its end. The last page now held a new entry, written in the same neat handwriting, but with a calmness that hadn't been there before. To whoever finds this, thank you. You have freed us. The cabin is yours now, free of its curse. Live well, and do not fear the shadows. They are only shadows. I stared at the words, my heart heavy with a mix of relief and sadness. Lila was gone, but she was at peace. And so was the cabin. I stood and made my way to the door, half expecting it to resist again, but the handle turned easily, and the cool night air greeted me as I stepped outside. The stars above were brighter than I had ever seen, and the forest was quiet, as if it, too, was finally at rest. I didn't look back as I walked to my car, the journal clutched tightly in my hand. Whatever had happened here, whatever I had faced, was over. The cabin would remain, a testament to the lives it had touched, but its dark history was finally behind it. As I drove away, the weight in my chest began to lift, replaced by a sense of calm. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The cabin, once a place of fear and despair, was now a place of peace. And so was I. I had been looking for months, searching for a place that would give me the space I needed to create without draining my wallet. The city was crowded, bustling, and expensive, but somehow I managed to find the perfect spot, or so I thought. The old studio sat at the very end of a quiet, narrow street, one that most people didn't even know existed. The buildings around it were run down, some abandoned, others barely hanging on. The windows were streaked with grime, and vines crept up the sides, making it look like it belonged in another time, maybe even another world. But there was something appealing about it, something that felt like it was waiting for me. When I called the landlord, a man named Mr. Henson, his voice was deep and gravelly, but friendly. He told me the place was cheap because it wasn't in the best condition. Still, I didn't mind. I didn't need luxury, just a quiet space to paint. I needed to escape the distractions of my cramped apartment and the noise of the city. This could be the fresh start I was looking for. When I arrived at the building, I wasn't sure what I expected, but it definitely wasn't this. The door was heavy, made of old oak that looked like it had seen better days. The brass handle was tarnished, and when I twisted it, the door groaned like an old man stretching in the morning. Inside, the hallway was dark, and the only light came from a single, flickering bulb at the end of the corridor. The air smelled musty, like wet cement and old cigarettes, the kind of smell you get when a place has been closed up for too long. I took a deep breath, trying not to let it get to me, and stepped inside. My shoes clicked against the tile floor as I walked. The hallway stretched on for what felt like miles, though it was probably just a few dozen feet. But as I moved farther down, something strange seemed to hang in the air, an unexplainable tension, as if the building was holding its breath. There were doors on either side of me, all closed, all silent. I couldn't hear a sound coming from any of them, which was odd for a building this size. It seemed like nobody was here. Maybe it was because it was still early in the morning, but the silence felt almost unnatural. Finally, I reached the door to the studio. I turned the handle and the door creaked open, revealing a room that was much larger than I had expected. The studio stretched out before me, its high ceilings making the space feel cavernous. The walls, however, were a different story. They were covered in dark stains, like water had been dripping down them for years, creating streaks that ran from the ceiling to the floor. It was the kind of thing you might see in an old abandoned building, and the sight immediately set my nerves on edge. I stepped inside, and as the door closed behind me, It made a sound that felt much heavier than it should have. The building was old, that much was clear, but this felt different. Almost as if the door didn't want to close, like it was reluctant to let me in. I shook off the thought and set my bag of art supplies down in the corner of the room. The studio had a concrete floor, covered in dust and patches of dirt. There was a single window on the far wall, but the glass was grimy and opaque, casting a dim light over everything. The window overlooked a narrow alley, and I could hear the occasional sound of cars passing by, their tires scraping against the cracked pavement. It felt distant, as though the world outside was far removed from this place. I set to work, unpacking my brushes and tubes of paint. I didn't expect to be comfortable here, not right away. I just wanted to get things in order, so I could begin painting as soon as possible. I needed to focus. I walked around the studio, taking note of the walls and the condition they were in. Some of the plaster was peeling away, and there were patches of mold in several places. I pushed on the walls, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingers. Some of the cracks seemed like they might be deeper than I initially thought. I wasn't sure if I could clean them up or if I would have to deal with them later. But for now, I needed to get my easel set up. The room felt unusually cold for a summer morning, and I noticed the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I arranged my things. It wasn't that the place was terrifying, it was just off. The odd stains on the walls kept drawing my eyes, and no matter how hard I tried to focus on something else, they always seemed to pull me back. They were dark, inky shapes, like spilled paint, and in the right light, they seemed to form faint silhouettes. Figures, perhaps? I told myself they were just stains. Nothing more. The rest of the morning passed slowly. The light from the window was weak, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow longer as the hours wore on. It wasn't until I finished setting up my easel and started to sketch that the odd sensations I had been feeling began to take shape. I stood in front of a blank canvas for several moments, trying to calm the unease that crept up on me, but my mind kept wandering. My hand moved hesitantly across the canvas, sketching a few lines, but I kept glancing around the room. The walls seemed to be closing in on me, the figures and the stains stretching out of the corners of my vision. I stood there for a while, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I had painted in many different studios over the years, but this was the first time I felt this way, like the space itself was watching me. It wasn't until later that night, when the last light from the window faded, that the full weight of the studio settled on me. The room was dark now, save for the overhead light, which flickered every so often, casting erratic shadows across the floor. The quiet was suffocating. The building creaked and groaned like an old house. The wind outside rattled the window, but it couldn't drown out the strange sounds I heard from within. The walls seemed to hum with a low, distant noise that I couldn't quite place. I set up my cot in the corner of the room, determined to rest. My nerves were frayed, but I told myself that it was just the newness of the place. It would take some time to adjust. I closed my eyes, trying to push the thoughts from my mind, but the sounds kept coming. The steady hiss of the radiator, the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath me. It was as if the building was alive, breathing and shifting in the darkness. But there was one sound that stood out more than the rest. The soft, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps. They were faint, coming from somewhere down the hallway. I opened my eyes, staring at the dark corner of the room where my supplies sat. The footsteps continued, getting closer and closer, as if someone was walking toward my door. I sat up, my heart racing, but the footsteps stopped before they reached my door. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, but the silence returned. It was just the building settling, I told myself. The studio was old, and it was probably full of strange noises, but even as I tried to reassure myself, a small part of me wondered if it was something else, something far less explainable. I eventually drifted off into an uneasy sleep, but it was not peaceful. My dreams were filled with strange shapes, dark, shifting figures, their faces hidden in the shadows. I woke up several times, convinced someone was standing by the window, staring in. Each time I would get up, turn on the lamp, and check, but there was never anything there. The next morning, I woke with a stiff neck and a dull headache. The coldness of the room seemed to seep into my bones. I forced myself out of bed, hoping that the fresh light of day would clear my head. I made a quick cup of coffee, its bitterness biting at my tired senses, and tried to shake off the dread that clung to me. The canvas still stood before me, an empty space waiting to be filled. My supplies were in disarray, and I felt the familiar urge to begin. I squeezed out some paint, mixing colors together, but my mind felt scattered. The brush moved on its own accord, painting shapes that didn't make sense. I didn't know what I was doing. My hand was moving without direction. When I stopped, I noticed the figure taking shape. It was there, unmistakable. A tall, thin figure with outstretched arms. It wasn't anything I planned, but it felt like the brush had a mind of its own. It was as if the studio was pushing me to paint it, and I couldn't escape. I turned around, heart pounding, expecting to see something, or someone, but the room was still. Only the walls, the stains, and the shadows remained. The day had only just begun, and yet I was already consumed by the fear of what was to come. I stared at the canvas in disbelief, my breath shallow and ragged. The figure that had appeared on the surface, tall, thin, its limbs unnaturally stretched, was unlike anything I had intended to paint. It wasn't a deliberate choice. My hand had moved without my control, and now the figure stared back at me, its outline eerily solid in the dim light of the studio. I had never been one for figurative art. Abstract was my style. Bold strokes, vibrant colors. Yet here I was, staring at a figure that seemed to take form without my consent. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves, but a cold feeling settled in my chest, spreading outward like an invisible hand tightening around my heart. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones, the air in the room growing thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The sounds of the studio, the squeaking of the floorboards, the soft hiss of the radiator, the distant hum of the pipes, seemed to fade into a muffled background. My entire focus was on that painting. It was as though the figure on the canvas was alive, its hollow eyes staring at me, watching my every move. I shook my head, willing myself to look away, but my gaze was drawn back to it again and again. I took a step back, rubbing my temples. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I needed some rest. It had been a long night, and I hadn't gotten much sleep. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost midday. I hadn't even realized how much time had passed. I tried to focus on something else. The studio, the walls, the space around me. But everything seemed to be in constant flux. The stains on the walls, those strange, dark marks, looked even more ominous now. It was as if the figures in the water stains were moving, shifting, growing larger with every passing moment. I could swear the edges of their shapes were slowly morphing, the outlines blurring and reforming in ways I couldn't explain. I walked around the room, trying to ignore the unsettling thoughts crowding my mind. My hand brushed against the rough plaster of the wall, the coldness of it sending a shiver up my spine. There were more patches of mold in the corners, and I could smell the mustiness growing stronger as I moved deeper into the studio. The place felt like it was slowly rotting from the inside out, each moment making it harder to ignore the sense that something was deeply wrong here. When I returned to the canvas, I froze. The figure on it had changed. Its arms, once outstretched in an awkward pose, were now reaching toward the left edge of the canvas, as if trying to break free. The fingers looked elongated, impossibly thin, like they were stretching beyond the bounds of the painting itself. I blinked, my heart racing. Had I imagined it? Had the figure always been this way? No, I was sure it hadn't been like this before. I could clearly remember the arms in their original position, but now they seemed to move with a mind of their own. I took a step closer to the painting, the air in the room thick with tension. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they hovered just above the surface of the canvas. The paint felt dry to the touch, solid, unmoving, and yet, the figure, it seemed alive. I pulled my hand back, instinctively wiping it on my pants. My breath was ragged, my pulse quickening. Something about this place, about this painting was messing with my mind. I needed to take a break, to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket, deciding to step outside for a few minutes. I needed to shake off the strange feeling creeping over me, to find some fresh air and reset. As I walked out of the studio and into the hallway, the flickering lights above seemed to pulse, casting an unsettling glow on the walls. The building was unnaturally silent, the only sound the faint hum of the lights overhead. The stairs creaked under my weight as I made my way down to the street. Outside, the sun was high, but the air felt unusually cool. I breathed deeply, trying to calm myself. The city was alive with noise, cars honking, people shouting, the distant sound of music blaring from somewhere. But it didn't help. The anxiety, the dread, still clung to me. I grabbed a quick lunch at a nearby deli, though I couldn't bring myself to eat much. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. My mind kept returning to the studio, to the figure on the canvas. What was it? Why had it appeared? I couldn't shake the feeling that the painting was trying to tell me something. Or worse, that it was drawing me in, pulling me deeper into its strange, unsettling world. When I returned to the studio, the silence was deafening. The overhead light was still on, but the shadows seemed darker, more oppressive. I stepped inside, my stomach tight, and made my way to the canvas. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. The figure had changed again. Now the arms weren't just outstretched, they were reaching toward me, as though the figure wanted to pull me in. Its face was still a hollow void, the eyes and mouth just dark, empty spaces, but the suggestion of something more was there. A presence, a force that seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I stood frozen, my hands shaking. The air in the room felt cold, colder than before. It was as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in the few minutes I had been gone. I could hear my own breath, shallow and uneven, as I stared at the painting. I needed to break free from this, to distance myself from whatever this was. I grabbed a fresh canvas and set it up on the opposite side of the room, trying to distract myself by focusing on something else. I dipped my brush into the paint, but my hand shook so badly I could barely control it. I tried to create something, anything, to wash away the image of that figure, but every stroke of the brush felt wrong. My mind wasn't there. The painting on the first canvas seemed to haunt me from the corner of my vision, like an invisible force drawing my gaze back to it no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. The figure wasn't just in the painting anymore. It was in the room, in the very air I breathed. Suddenly there was a soft knock at the door. It was quiet at first, but then louder, more insistent. My heart skipped a beat as I froze, staring at the door handle. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and there was no reason for anyone to be here. The landlord, Mr. Henson, had warned me that the building was mostly empty, save for a few tenants. I was alone. The knock came again, this time sharper, more urgent. I stood up slowly, my feet heavy as I moved toward the door. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I reached for the handle, my fingers cold against the metal. I hesitated, but then opened it just a crack. There was nobody there. The hallway outside was empty, the dim light flickering above, casting long, uneven shadows on the walls. I stepped into the hall, looking both ways. The air was still, quiet, too quiet. The hallway was just as empty as it had been earlier. No footsteps, no sounds, nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if something was watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to turn around. I stepped back into the studio, locking the door behind me. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I glanced at the canvas again. The figure had moved again. Its arms were now raised high, as though reaching out to grab something, or someone. I stepped closer, my breath quick and shallow. The figure wasn't just a painting anymore. It was more than that. I could feel its presence in the room, its coldness pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing. I needed to get out. I couldn't stay here, not with that thing watching me. But as I turned to leave, I heard a noise. Faint at first, then louder, coming from the far corner of the room. It was the softest whisper, almost like a voice, but it was so quiet that I couldn't make out the words. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper seemed to grow louder, clearer, until it sounded like my name. Lucas. I spun around, but the room was empty. The canvas was still there, the figure still staring at me. Its arms were still outstretched. But now, I could see something else, two shapes, faint but unmistakable, moving behind it. I froze. The shapes in the shadows began to take form, becoming clearer with each passing moment. A pair of hands, long and thin, reaching out from behind the figure, emerging from the darkness like something alive. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to move. The shapes grew closer, the hands reaching toward me. I could feel them, feel the cold air they carried, reaching out from the painting, as if they were trying to pull me in. And then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the lights flickered, the room plunged into darkness, and everything went silent. The darkness was suffocating. It swallowed every trace of light, leaving nothing but an impenetrable void around me. The silence pressed in like a heavy weight, suffocating my lungs, and for a moment, I thought I had gone deaf. I stood frozen in place, heart hammering in my chest, every nerve on edge, waiting for the lights to flicker back on, for the strange shapes in the painting to shift again. But nothing happened. There was only stillness. Then, a cold breeze swept across the room. It was so sudden and sharp, it cut through the air, making me shiver involuntarily. The chill felt wrong, unnatural, like it was coming from somewhere far beyond the room itself, from the depths of the building, or perhaps from something far worse. My breath came out in visible clouds, even though I hadn't moved. The temperature had dropped too quickly, too drastically. I fumbled for the lamp on the desk, my hands shaking so violently I could barely get a grip on the base. I turned it on with a click, but the light sputtered, casting weak, uneven shadows across the room. For a moment, it seemed like the world had been reduced to nothing but half-lit corners and creeping darkness. The painting. I couldn't avoid it anymore. It had become the focal point of everything. Its figure, its shifting limbs, its unblinking stare. I knew I had to face it, to understand it, even if it terrified me. I turned slowly toward the canvas. The figure was different now, more distorted than I remembered, and it was no longer just a figure. It was a shape, a dark, looming presence that seemed to pulsate with something other than paint. It wasn't a human form anymore. It was something alive, something hungry. I felt my stomach twist with dread. The thing in the painting wasn't just a creation of my own making. It was something much older, much darker. I could feel its gaze on me, even in the darkness, even without the full light of the lamp. Its arms, which had once seemed harmless, now looked like they were reaching for me, stretching out toward the space between us with a slow, deliberate hunger. I took a step back, my body moving on its own, instinctively wanting to flee. But then, something inside me snapped. I couldn't run away from this. Not anymore. With shaking hands, I reached out and grabbed the edge of the canvas. The moment my fingers touched the rough, painted surface, a jolt of ice shot up my arm. The cold wasn't just surface level. It was inside me, burrowing deep. The canvas felt like it was alive, like it was breathing, pulsing under my touch. I ripped my hand away, gasping for air, but the air itself had grown thicker, more oppressive. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very air. It felt like the room was alive, too, like it was breathing along with the painting, like the whole building was somehow connected to whatever had been trapped inside those walls, inside the figure on the canvas. I turned toward the door, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run. But before I could take a step, I heard it, a sound that chilled me to the bone, a voice. "Lucas." It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear. It was calling my name. The voice was deep, resonating through the room like a low growl, and it wasn't coming from anywhere I could see. It felt like it was coming from the painting itself, from the walls, from the very foundation of the building. It was everywhere. My blood ran cold. I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay here another second. But just as I reached for the door, something stopped me. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, the room was bathed in a sickly green glow. In that split second, I saw it. The figure in the painting was no longer still. It was moving. Its arms, those impossibly long arms, were reaching out, twisting and contorting, extending beyond the confines of the canvas, as though they were trying to pull themselves free from the painting. I gasped, stumbling backward. The figure's face, that empty void of eyes and mouth, seemed to be looking directly at me. A dark presence staring at me through the layers of paint, as if it could see me, feel me. My vision blurred, and I had to blink several times to focus. But the longer I stared, the more it seemed to pull at me. The darkness inside the figure deepened, and I felt a pull, like a magnetic force, an invisible thread drawing me closer, pulling me toward it. I knew I had to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. And then, without warning, the room plunged into darkness again. This time, it wasn't just the light flickering. The whole building seemed to go silent, as if time itself had stopped. I heard a low thud, like something heavy falling to the ground. The sound came from behind me, from the corner of the room, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. I stepped toward the sound, every nerve in my body screaming for me to turn and run, but my feet carried me forward, as though some unseen force was guiding me. I reached the corner. The floor was covered in shadows, the lamp's light too weak to reveal anything clearly. But then I saw it. A shadow, a figure, was crouched in the corner, its back turned to me, unmoving. I knew what I was seeing. It wasn't just a shadow. It was the same figure from the painting. It had come to life. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. The figure in the corner slowly turned its head, and those empty eyes, those deep, hollow voids, locked onto mine. I could feel the weight of its gaze, like a hand pressing down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. The figure's mouth opened. A low, guttural sound came from deep within, like a growl, or was it laughter? I couldn't tell. The words that followed were clear, chilling. "Don't you see? You're part of me now." I tried to step back, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the air had thickened, become sticky, and my body was trapped in place. The figure took a step toward me, its arms stretched out, those impossibly long fingers reaching for me. I closed my eyes, bracing for the worst. I felt its cold touch, like ice against my skin, and the instant it made contact, I was flooded with a vision. The room, the studio, was gone. The building dissolved around me, and I was surrounded by darkness, by an infinite void. But it wasn't empty. There were figures here, hundreds of them, moving in the darkness, their faces the same as the one in the painting, their empty eyes staring at me, watching me with a hunger I couldn't understand. The painting wasn't just a painting, it was a doorway, a portal, and it had drawn me in. I had unknowingly opened a path between this world and whatever nightmare lay beyond it. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the void, and then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything stopped. I was back in the studio, standing in front of the canvas. The figure was no longer in the corner. The room was silent. The air had returned to normal. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking, my mind reeling. What had just happened? Had I imagined it all? I glanced at the canvas. The figure on it was gone. There was nothing but blank space now, the canvas empty, as if the figure had never existed. The walls, too, seemed quieter. The stains no longer looked like faces. The studio felt normal again. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the room, something that hadn't been there before. A hand, thin and outstretched, reaching. I froze. The hand wasn't part of the painting, it was real, and it was reaching for me. I ran. I ran out of the studio, out of the building, and into the cold night air. I never looked back. And as I left that cursed place behind, I heard it again. That voice. Lucas. But this time, it was distant, faint. It felt like it was calling from somewhere far away, beyond the painting, beyond the studio, beyond everything. And I knew, in that moment, that whatever had been in that room, whatever had been trapped within the walls and the paint, would always be with me. Forever. I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened to me when I was younger. It's a little spooky, but don't worry. I made it out safe in the end. My name's Grant, and I used to love exploring the woods behind our little town of Millstone. I'd grown up there, and I knew the trails like the back of my hand. I wasn't scared of much, at least not until the day this happened. Let me introduce you to my friends. There's Noah, who's my best friend. Noah's the kind of guy who always has a joke ready. He's funny, but sometimes he doesn't know when to stop. Then there's Tessa. Tessa's a bookworm, always carrying a notebook where she writes down things she finds interesting. Lastly, there's our younger neighbor Evelyn, who's only 9, but braver than most grown-ups I know. This story happened on a summer day, not too hot, with just the right amount of breeze. We all decided to explore a new trail near Maple Creek, a place we'd heard about from some older kids. They said the trail was weird, but they wouldn't tell us why. That only made us more curious. We met up at the edge of the forest early in the morning. Noah was carrying a big backpack stuffed with snacks, flashlights, and even a magnifying glass he insisted we'd need. Tessa brought her notebook and pencils, ready to jot down anything interesting, and Evelyn had a small old compass her grandpa had given her. She said it always pointed north, but we later found out it didn't. The trail started out normal enough. The dirt path was lined with tall trees, their leaves whispering as the wind passed through. Birds chirped above us, and once in a while, we'd hear a squirrel darting through the underbrush. Noah was cracking jokes about how he'd heard the forest was haunted, and Tessa kept rolling her eyes. Haunted? Yeah, right, Tessa said. If it's haunted, then where are all the ghosts? Noah grinned. Maybe they're shy, he said, wiggling his fingers like he was casting a spell. Evelyn giggled, but I didn't laugh. Something about the forest felt different that day. I couldn't explain it, but I kept that thought to myself. As we walked deeper into the woods, the sound started to change. The birds stopped chirping, and the only noise was the crunch of our boots on the trail. The air felt heavier somehow, like the trees were leaning closer, listening. That's when we saw the first strange thing. A pile of clothes on the trail. That's weird, Evelyn said, pointing. Why would someone leave their clothes here? It was a full outfit, neatly arranged, like someone had been lying there and just disappeared. There were boots, socks, a shirt, and pants. No one said anything for a moment. Then Noah laughed nervously. "Probably a prank," he said, though he didn't sound so sure. "Maybe someone's trying to scare us." Tessa took out her notebook and scribbled something down. "This is strange," she said quietly. We kept walking. A few minutes later, we saw another pile. This one wasn't clothes, but camping gear. There were backpacks, sleeping bags, and even a small tent, all thrown into a heap in the middle of the trail. "Okay, this is getting creepy," Noah admitted, glancing around. "Who leaves all this stuff out here?" I shrugged, but my stomach felt tight. "Maybe someone's coming back for it," I said, though I didn't believe it. Evelyn looked up at me. "Grant, do you think we should keep going?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but I could tell she was nervous. "We'll just go a little farther," I said, trying to sound confident. "If we don't find anything, we'll turn back." Not long after, we came to the strangest sight yet. 2 tall trees stood on either side of the trail, their branches twisted together to form an arch. Hanging from the arch were small animal skulls, tied with pieces of old string. They swayed gently in the breeze, making soft clinking sounds as they knocked together. "Nope, nope, nope," Noah said, backing away. "This is officially too weird." But Tessa was already pulling out her notebook. "Wait," she said. "What kind of skulls are these?" "Does it matter?" Noah asked, his voice rising. "This is like some kind of creepy ritual stuff. We need to leave." I felt the same chill Noah did, but I didn't want to admit it. Instead, I said, "Let's just take a quick look around. We'll stay close together." We stepped through the archway, and that's when the forest went completely silent. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves. It was like the world had hit pause. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could tell the others felt it too. "I don't like this," Evelyn whispered, clutching her compass. The needle was spinning wildly, not pointing anywhere. "Okay, we're done," I said. "Let's head back." But as we turned to leave, we heard a sound. It was faint at first, like someone humming a low tune. Then it got louder, more like buzzing, and it seemed to be coming from all around us. We froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. "What is that?" Tessa asked, her voice barely a whisper. Before anyone could answer, a dark cloud appeared between the trees. At first, I thought it was smoke, but then I saw it was moving. It was a swarm of insects, thousands of tiny black flies, all buzzing in unison. The sound was deafening. "Run!" I yelled. We took off down the trail, the swarm chasing us. The buzzing grew louder, and I could feel the flies crawling on my skin, their tiny wings brushing against my face. Evelyn screamed, and Noah was swatting at the air, trying to keep them away. Somehow, we made it back to the archway. As soon as we passed under it, the swarm stopped. Just like that, the buzzing faded, and the flies disappeared into the trees. We didn't stop running until we were back at the edge of the forest. Breathless and shaken, we looked at each other, trying to make sense of what had happened. "That was not normal," Noah said, his voice trembling. Tessa nodded, clutching her notebook. "I don't think we should come back here," she said. Evelyn looked at her compass, which was still spinning. "I don't think we should tell anyone," she said quietly. "They wouldn't believe us anyway." And so, we never went back to Maple Creek. We never talked about what we saw that day, but sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the buzzing. And I wonder if the forest is still there, waiting for someone else to find its secrets. Hi there. My name is Finn, and I'm 12 years old. I live in a small town called Maplewood, where everyone knows each other. My mom says it's a safe place, but something happened last week that made me wonder if that's really true. Let me tell you the story. It all started on a Thursday after school. I was walking home like I always do. My best friend Ollie usually walks with me, but he had to stay late for math club. Ollie is super smart, the kind of kid who'd rather solve puzzles than play video games. Anyway, I was on my own that day, taking the shortcut through Cedar Park. It's a big park with lots of trees and a gravel path that winds all the way to my neighborhood. I've walked through that park hundreds of times. The air smells like pine needles, and sometimes you can hear squirrels chattering in the trees. There are a few old wooden benches along the path where people sit to rest. That day, one of those benches wasn't empty. A man was sitting there. He looked like he was waiting for something or someone. The man was probably in his 40s, with scruffy hair and a gray jacket that looked too big for him. I'd never seen him before, but that didn't surprise me. People from the nearby city sometimes come to Maplewood for the fresh air. He had a backpack by his feet and a half-empty soda bottle in his hand. I didn't think much of it. He wasn't doing anything unusual, just sitting and staring at the path. As I got closer, I noticed him watching me. At first, I thought maybe he just wanted to say hi. People in Maplewood are friendly like that. But when I passed by, he mumbled something under his breath. I couldn't hear what he said, so I kept walking. Then he stood up. "Hey, kid," he called out, his voice rough like he had a cold. I turned around. Hi?" I said, trying not to sound scared. My mom always says to be polite, but something about him made my stomach feel tight, like when you're about to take a test you didn't study for. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" he asked, taking a step toward me. His eyes didn't look friendly. They were too wide, like he was excited about something. "Just home," I said quickly and started walking faster. I could hear his footsteps behind me. "Don't be scared," he said, his voice getting louder. "I just want to talk." I didn't answer. I pulled out my phone and held it tight. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I've always been told to call for help if something feels wrong, but I couldn't think straight. All I could do was keep walking. "Hey kid, are you deaf?" he shouted. Now I was really scared. I turned on the camera on my phone and tried to record him without looking back. My hands were shaking so much that I wasn't sure if I was even pointing it in the right direction. "Leave me alone," I finally shouted, my voice cracking. I didn't sound brave at all, but I hoped it would scare him off. It didn't. "Come on, I'm just being friendly," he said, but his grin looked more like a snarl. Then he held up the soda bottle and said, "Want a sip?" "No!" I yelled and started running. My backpack bounced against my shoulders as I sprinted down the path. I could hear his footsteps quickening behind me. When I reached the end of the park, I saw Mr. Harper, my neighbor, working in his front yard. Mr. Harper is a retired firefighter. He's tall and strong, with a big gray mustache that makes him look like he belongs in an old movie. I ran straight to him. "Mr. Harper, help!" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. He turned around, startled, and saw me pointing back toward the park. The man who had been following me stopped at the edge of the path. When he saw Mr. Harper, he hesitated, then turned and walked away like nothing had happened. "What's going on, Finn?" Mr. Harper asked, his voice calm but serious. I told him everything, and he immediately called the police. They came quickly, but the man was gone by then. They said they'd keep an eye on the park and told me to avoid walking there alone. Since that day, I've been taking the long way home. It adds an extra 10 minutes, but I don't care. I'd rather feel safe. I haven't seen the man again, but sometimes I think about his creepy grin and how close he got to grabbing me. It's a memory that makes me shiver, even in the middle of the day. So if you're ever walking home alone and see someone who gives you a bad feeling, don't ignore it. Be brave, but also be smart, and always, always trust your gut. My name is Ethan, and I live in a small town called Willow Creek. It's a quiet place with long stretches of woods, a small lake, and houses scattered far apart. My wife Lily and I moved here with our daughter Emily after she was born. Emily is 12 now, and she's always been the adventurous type. She'd rather climb trees or hunt for frogs by the lake than sit inside. Our neighbors, the Morgans, have a son named Caleb, who is a year older than Emily. The two of them became best friends quickly. Caleb is funny, full of energy, and always coming up with wild ideas for their games. When summer came, Emily and Caleb started spending even more time together. Caleb had an incredible imagination. One day, they'd be pirates searching for hidden treasure. The next, they were spies on a mission to save the world. I loved seeing Emily laugh and run around, even though their games sometimes made me shake my head. Once, Caleb called our house pretending to be a scientist, saying Emily had to come over immediately to help stop a monster that had escaped his lab. She played along every time, and I couldn't help but smile as she grabbed a toy sword and raced out the door. One Saturday evening, Caleb called again. This time, his voice was more serious than usual. He told Emily there was a magical traveler by the creek who promised to grant wishes if they completed a quest. I overheard the call and chuckled to myself. Typical Caleb, always coming up with some wild idea. Emily was thrilled and asked if she could go. I nodded, but something about the idea of a traveler made me uneasy. After Emily left, I sat down, trying to shake off the nagging feeling in my chest. Caleb's stories were always made up, but I couldn't stop wondering about the traveler. I decided to check in with Caleb's parents, Mark and Jenna. When I called, Jenna sounded confused. "Caleb already left on his bike to meet Emily," she said. "He told us they were meeting by the creek." That's when my stomach tightened. Caleb never left without picking up Emily first. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my jacket, told Lily I was going to check on the kids, and headed out. The creek was about a 10-minute walk from our house, tucked away behind the woods. When I got there, Emily was standing alone, looking around. She seemed confused. "Where's Caleb?" she asked. I didn't want to scare her, so I kept my voice calm. "Maybe he's running late. Let's wait a little longer." But Caleb didn't show up. Emily started calling his name, but the only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. I decided to walk further along the creek with her to see if Caleb was nearby. We called his name over and over, but there was no answer. Then Emily spotted something. "Dad, look." She pointed to a bike hidden under some bushes. It was Caleb's. Emily pulled it out, her hands shaking. "Why would he leave his bike here?" she asked. I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm for Emily. "Let's keep looking," I said, though my voice sounded shakier than I wanted it to. We walked a little further along the creek until Emily gasped again. "Dad, it's his shoe." Sure enough, one of Caleb's sneakers was lying near the edge of the water, half covered in mud. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I wanted to tell Emily to go home, but I didn't want to leave her alone, and I couldn't bring myself to let her know how scared I was. "Emily, stay close to me," I said. My voice was firmer this time. "We're going back to Caleb's house to let his parents know what's going on." Emily nodded, clutching my hand tightly as we walked back through the woods. When we reached Caleb's house, Mark and Jenna's faces turned pale as I told them what we'd found. Mark didn't waste a second. He grabbed his flashlight, and we called the police before heading back to the creek together. Emily stayed with Lily and Jenna, though she begged to come with us. The police arrived quickly and started searching the area. They brought dogs and flashlights, combing every inch of the woods and the creek. I stayed with Mark, helping as much as I could. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. The woods grew darker, and the air felt heavy. Still, there was no sign of Caleb. The next day, more people joined the search. Friends, neighbors, even strangers from nearby towns. But Caleb was gone. Days turned into weeks, and despite everyone's efforts, he was never found. The disappearance of Caleb changed everything. Mark and Jenna were heartbroken. They couldn't stay in Willow Creek after what happened and decided to move away. Emily struggled too. She stopped playing outside, and her laughter became rare. She would sit by the window, staring at the woods, as if hoping Caleb might come back one day. Even now, years later, I can still see Caleb's bright smile in my mind. I still wonder what really happened that day by the creek. And every time Emily walks out the door, I feel that same knot in my stomach, that same fear that something might take her away too. So remember, kids, it's good to have adventures and explore, but always stay close to the people who care about you. And if you ever hear about a magical traveler offering wishes, maybe it's better to stay far, far away.